Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to the first public program held here by the JDC Archives in Jerusalem. The lecture you're about to hear will be given by a recipient of one of our 2 annual fellowships, the Fred and Ellen Lewis Fellowship. This fellowship, along with the David Masher Fellowship, is awarded annually to outstanding researchers who wish to explore in depth the wonderful resources and materials we have here in the JDC Archives, here and in the New York Archives, mainly in the field of modern Jewish history. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Anna Manchin. Anna has a Ph.D. in modern European history from Brown University. Her dissertation, Fables of Modernity, Entertainment, Films, and Social Imaginary in Interwar Hungary, explored interwar Hungarian nationalism and Jewish identity through film. Her research focuses mainly on modern Central European cultural history through the changing ideas of Jewishness, gender, and nationalism in the 20th century. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Pannon University in Hungary. She has published articles on Jewishness in popular culture in interwar and contemporary Hungary, in East European Jewish Affairs, Hungarian Quarterly, Polin, and other journals. Her work at the JDC Archives explores the post-World War II reconstruction of Jewish life, including the changing ideas of Jewishness in Hungary. Anna.
Thank you, Shahar. And I want to thank the JDC for inviting me to give this lecture and also for the opportunity to come to Jerusalem and to do research in this fantastic archive. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I would like to start with a strange newspaper article which I found while looking through post-war Hungary's only Jewish newspaper.
We can't hear you so well.
You can't hear me well, okay. I'd like to start with a strange newspaper article which I found while looking through post-war Hungary's only Jewish newspaper, Új Élet, New Life. This is it. The article appeared a few weeks after Passover on April 26 of 1946 under the title Matzo Wars in the Capital. It read, "When the American matzo arrived in Budapest recently and was distributed to everyone for free, within a few hours the black market, outdoor marketplaces, and entryways of apartment buildings noted a sudden and inexplicable rise in prices." Thanks. People were buying a kilogram of matzo for 20, 30, 70 million pengus. So the story began, and as you will see, it only got stranger. So I was intrigued. Why was there such an abundance of matzo in 1946 Budapest? Where was it from? Who was it for? And why was it sold on the black market for 70 million a box? After some digging, I located some evidence on a shipment of matzo that was sent by the Joint. This is a summary of what was shipped in February of 1946. The Joint, of course, is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which at the time was the world's largest humanitarian relief organization. It had shipped a donation of 500,000 pounds of matzo to Hungary. 400,000 was from Manischewitz and 100,000 was from Straight. This was part of the Joint's $50 million aid to the surviving Jewish communities in Europe and around the world. Hungary received one of the biggest shipments, not only because it was at this time the second largest surviving community in Europe, but also because by many accounts it was the poorest. This is how the Joint Secretary described the situation in the JDC's 1945 annual report. "The general situation in Hungary is extremely bad. The country, which suffered considerable destruction of wealth, is going through a grave economic crisis. The uncontrolled inflationary movement has practically destroyed the value of the pengu in Hungary. The Jewish situation, destroyed the value of a pengu, and people live only by selling their belongings. Bad as is the general situation, the Jewish situation is infinitely worse. Displaced and mistreated, deprived of their homes, their businesses, and their properties, Jews are attempting to lift themselves by their bootstraps in the economic chaos that exists in Hungary today." So the devastation of the war in the last few months on Hungarian soil and the ravages of Soviet occupation gave all of the population the sense that they suffered as victims of the occupying armies. The government had been printing money to finance the war and then later for rebuilding and reparations, and this is partly what led to the pengu's collapse and the 1946 hyperinflation that was up till that point the worst in history. Not only was money worthless, there was nothing to buy either. Budapest had been thoroughly destroyed. Hospitals and medication were scarce. Droughts and other problems also caused a food shortage. Food had to be rationed in 1945 and 1946, and Hungary received very little help from international aid organizations except for the Joint. Budapest's Jewish population, which was around 200 and 250,000 in 1945, was made up disproportionately of assimilated, secular, middle and upper middle class Jews. But they were destitute. Indeed, the majority of Hungary's Jewish population required the support of the Joint for food, clothing, medical care, and money necessary for survival. This is an image that is in the Joint archives about Jews returning to Hungary from Mauthausen and Buchenwald. And here's a picture of the JDC canteen and the children's home that owned the goat. Apparently, I love that picture, so I had to put it in. It's not clear how high matzo was on Jews' list of priorities. By March, the Hungarian government was able to provide matzo for those who paid for it in advance, using food tickets. In any case, the joint matzo didn't make it to Hungary by April 15th, the first Passover Seder in 1946. When it arrived a few days late, it caused a great commotion. A historian of the Joint noted that the matzo was of such good quality that even non-Jews wanted to get their hands on it. There are, however, other explanations, as the article in Új Élet suggests. And it claims Matzo Wars, Matzo Revolution, small aerocross, which is the Hungarian Fascist Party, success at Pesach, fake journalists, fake detectives, fake Democrats, and apostates scrambling for matzo. So, based on this article, my talk will address three main questions. Why did the arrival of Passover matzo in 1946 Budapest become the center of controversy and scandal, leading to these accusations of international Jewish conspiracy, Jewish anti-Semitism, and the fake reporters and Democrats and detectives? Second, what can this small incident, or more specifically, the Új Élet, the journal's explanation of it, tell us about the meaning of Jewishness in immediate post-war Hungary? And finally, the third, how does this relate to the larger history of Jewishness and Hungarianness in 19th and 20th century Hungary? What I'm suggesting, and following the work of Lisa Silverman and others, it's not just my own idea, is that the meaning of Jewishness versus non-Jewishness was changeable. It meant different things at different times and shifted with changing political, social, and cultural contexts. Additionally, at no time was this boundary between Jewishness and non-Jewishness uncontested. Although, of course, it reflected some general consensus, it was also the subject of constant negotiation. So I'll argue that this incident with the matzo helps illuminate how this category was discussed in this specific historical moment. But before I get into the matzo affair, I want to step back a little bit to give you the bigger picture and to make a case for why all this is relevant. So why am I talking about Hungary? I mean, after all, Hungary often seems like a small and marginal country, and its Jewry may be a footnote to the story of the larger European or Western Jewry. And until recently, it was marginal in scholarship, which has partly to do with language and partly to do with politics, which I can talk about more later. But really, it's not marginal at all. In fact, Hungarian Jewry was the second largest Jewish community in Europe before World War I and became the largest again in 1944 with 800,000 Jews. It was also a unique community, one of the most diverse. I mean, you can kind of liken it to contemporary New York City. Jews in Hungary ranged from the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic communities who lived mostly in the Northeast to the highly assimilated, secular, and patriotic bourgeoisie of Budapest. And it was equally split between Orthodox and assimilationists before World War I. The Hungarian Jewish community was also exceptionally successful and influential. Most Jewish groups considered themselves members of the Hungarian nation. They spoke Hungarian, participated in public life as Hungarians, and compared to Austria, Germany, and Czechoslovakia, Hungary's Jewish population was bigger and more important in national terms. For example, nearly a third of Budapest's population was Jewish in 1920, and though they made up only 5% of the total population, they played a leading role in modern Hungarian public life. They thought themselves relatively safe in Hungary until 1944, And for the most part, they were until the deportations began in March of 1944 and the German occupation began. So, oops. I turned something. Okay, no, I got it. Okay, so just to give you a sense, this is a 1941 international fair in Budapest. And, okay, here you can see Weiss Manfred, and this one is Goldberger. These were very big Jewish-owned companies that were exhibiting at the fair. And just so you see, this is Hungary, and this is Hungary after World War I, and this is Austria-Hungary before World War I. Okay. Okay. Hungarian Jewry also suffered devastating losses. Jews from the countryside were deported and murdered in the summer of 1944. But the majority of Jews in Budapest survived. Hungary also had the largest European community after Romania's 330,000 in 1945. But unlike in Romania, the majority stayed in Hungary. Around 200,000 people stayed in Hungary. So although today Berlin and Paris have larger Jewish populations than Budapest, which today is around 100, 120, depends on how you count, Budapest is still the largest continuous non-immigrant one. And most Hungarian Jews are deeply rooted, with families going back 5, 8, 10 generations. Okay, so all this is to say that I'm talking about a large and important community. And now I want to give you some idea of why the post-war period is interesting. For one, because Jewishness as an issue was not much discussed either before then or after then. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, Jewishness in Hungary was a sensitive topic, even a taboo topic. That's because of a strange unspoken arrangement in Hungary, according to which Jews would claim to be Hungarians. In exchange, no one would bring up their Jewishness. In other words, Hungarian Jews were supposed to be Jewish in religion only, not an ethnic minority, but part of the Hungarian nation since the mid-19th century. In fact, until 1919, 1920, the political establishment, for both political and economic reasons, officially rejected anti-Semitism and supported assimilation. The reason for this was not lack of anti-Semitism in general, I mean, it was there, but because they considered Jews necessary for modernizing Hungary. Jews were Hungary's industrial, commercial, and financial engine, and for increasing the share of Hungarians in a multi-ethnic society. And I'll show you a map of the ethnicities. This is Hungary before World War I. The pink are Hungarians, and all the other ones are different. Germans, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Croats and Serbs, Slovenes, Bulgarians, Italians. So you can see Hungary wasn't even 50% without the Jews. So in political discourse, Jews were accepted as Hungarians, but this didn't mean that Jews were actually fully accepted as Hungarians in everyday life and culture. In fact, even if they converted to Christianity, they were generally still seen as Jewish. Though how this affected everyday experience is an area that still requires a lot more research. In the interwar years, this way of thinking about Jews was damaged, but it wasn't totally destroyed. But after World War I, the Hungarian political establishment became overtly anti-Semitic, and Jewishness was increasingly seen as an ethnic and racial category in conflict with and in competition with Christian Hungary. After 1938, but in fact already starting in 1920, the government ended legal equality, and public discourse increasingly rejected the possibilities of assimilation and integration. So after World War II, there was a clear sense that the earlier approach of assimilation and silence had failed. For the first time, Zionism achieved mass support in Hungary. Some people returned to religion, and a majority said that they were considering emigrating. There was also a beginning of open discussion of what it was to be Jewish, what it meant to be Jewish in Hungary. Béla Zsolt, a Jewish Hungarian writer and a radical party politician, in fact one of the first to publish Holocaust memoir, 9 Suitcases in 1946, wrote in the same newspaper that I'm talking about in 1946 about the interwar and the post-war ways of talking about Jewishness. He writes, "I remember the careful, fussy, and roundabout ways in which we tried to find synonyms for the word Jew because we didn't want to use the word itself, a red cape waved before everyone's eyes. We mentioned liberals, a certain group or stratum, a certain faith. People generally obfuscated because they wanted to avoid open confrontation. It was finally when I was attacked as a Jew that I had to write down this designation." So after the war, there was a sense that finally the cat was out of the bag, the issue of Jewishness should now be openly discussed. Yet, though in the years following the war, there was a hope that this new openness for discussing these issues would be there and would be taken, there was also a continued uneasiness and confusion and politicization of Jewishness. New times also brought new challenges, and there was pushback to open discussion from the general population, from the communist leadership, and from the Jewish community itself. On the one hand, anti-Semitism didn't go away. Quite to the contrary, it was more strongly felt than ever in post-war Hungary. There were at least 3 pogroms in 1945 and 1946, in which several people were killed. And Hungarians felt that they had been victims of the war as well, and were reluctant to consider the special suffering of Jews. Privately, there were continued accusations of Jewish treason, communism, and capitalist exploitation. And then, of course, there were the communists. In 1945, Hungary was liberated by the Soviets, which meant that Hungary came under Soviet occupation, which lasted pretty much until 1989. And there you can see, that's Hungary, it was a communist country. So, although the Soviet communist regime was not formally established until 1948, 1949, communist influence was already strongly and widely felt. And I just want to show you 2 images. This is 1946, May Day, so Labor Day celebrations in Budapest led by the communists. Yeah, long live Labor Day. Yeah, so in fact, the communists, many of Hungary's Jewish leaders, or many of Hungary's communist leaders were themselves Jewish, were widely unpopular. And because they themselves had so much to lose, the communist leadership had little interest in talking about Jews, basically bringing up their own Jewishness. What's more, they actually tried to exploit anti-Semitism for their own advantage. And more ideologically, the communists acknowledged victims of fascism only in general terms. We're quick to include the population at large who were seen as victims themselves. More perversely, as a large segment of Hungary's Jews had been members of the middle and upper middle class, they came to be seen as enemies of the people, enemies of the communists, as anti-communists, as agents of oppression, and were ostracized and punished by the new regime. Jewish Hungary faced further problems. Jewish Hungarians faced further problems when claiming that they suffered on account of racial persecution and demanded compensation on that basis. In fact, this was a common development not only in Hungary, but also throughout European refugee and DP camps. Their use of ethnicity as a concept was rejected by the general population. Many Jews were also reluctant to embrace this ethnic definition because it was unfamiliar and it didn't fit with Hungarian Jewish history. It placed Jews as a group in opposition to non-Jewish Hungarians, while Jewish Hungarians had always insisted that they didn't form a single interest group, that Jews did not exist as a political entity. So after this brief background, I want to now return to the Matzo Wars article and argue that the 1946 Matzo incident shows us how the category of Jewishness was invoked in this volatile but quickly changing political and economic context. The Matzo affair became an occasion to debate ethnicity, race, political affiliation, and patriotism. So I'll give some context for the article and then look closely at some of its claims and highlight a few key points regarding how Jewish and non-Jewish, the categories of Jewish and non-Jewish shaped Hungarian society in the post-war years. The newspaper it appeared in, Új Élet, New Life, is interesting because it represents a new post-war institution that was responding to the changing needs of the Jewish community. It addressed Jews not as a religious group, but as an ethnic group. It was the only Jewish paper and spoke to all religious factions, the Neolog, the Orthodox, the status quo, and even secular Jews. It was first published in November of 1945, and its contents ranged from practical, everyday public information about institutions and legislation, political speeches and events that were relevant to Jewish life in Hungary, things that would have been important to everyone who had been persecuted as a Jew in the past. It also had articles and series of articles that tried to explain the recent past, including systems of persecution, recollections about ghetto life, the concentration camps appeared. And it also sought to help people in the present with advertisements looking for lost relatives, items for sale, even personals looking for love and marriage. But although Új Élet published a wide range of voices at first, its authors eventually tended to represent the religious leadership and urged Jews to return to the faith. And the paper was also increasingly infiltrated by voices close to the Communist Party. By 1948, most Jewish publications were shut down by the communists, but Új Élet was allowed to operate, though it was restricted to articles expressing official party politics and articles on religious life. The Matzo War article, which was unsigned, is not one of the official declarations and rallying calls that often appeared in the paper, and it even fails to offer any kind of coherent or logical argument. But I think it's really interesting because it shows how ideas about Jewishness emerged in a new context, and yet how they were also shaped by earlier understandings of Jewishness, including fears, myths, and stereotypes about Jews. Okay, so this is the part that I read before. This is how the article explains why people were buying a kilogram of matzo for 20, 30, or 70 million pengu. It says, this year's blood libel was born in style. Whispering propaganda spread the libel that there were dollars in the matzo boxes. This is why people, regardless of their religious affiliation, were so eager to purchase the gift boxes, and thousands of misled and cheated people believed the story told by the swindlers, that there had in fact been dollars in them, but they were stolen. Okay, so in a way, the incident itself is not that remarkable. After all, in the history of humanitarian aid, it was not unheard of for aid to be stolen or improperly distributed or sold on the black market, especially in the chaotic and desperate and lawless societies where aid is usually most needed. More interesting to me is the interpretation, or the multiple versions of interpretations offered by the article. Okay, to summarize what's happening, it's unclear from this rendition of the story who stole and sold the matzo. Was it the Jews selling it on the black market, but they could get it for free? Was whoever stole and sold it selling fake products? Did they know that there were no dollars in it? Was their success aided by people's own primitive beliefs about Jews? Interestingly, the libel here is not that the matzo had Christian, children's, or virgins' blood in it, but that it had US dollars in it. Or that it held the promise of US dollars, but in fact, Hungarian money or blood was taken in exchange for the matzo. So to put this in context a little bit, in the spring and summer of 1946, and starting in February, amidst economic collapse and rampant inflation, blood libel accusations and other anti-Jewish slogans resurfaced across the Hungarian countryside. There were several outbreaks of violence, and some of them turned fatal. Earlier in the year, the communist government cynically used visual stereotypes of Jews in their campaigns against black marketeers and speculators, which also fed into anti-Semitic violence. Stereotypes about Jewish wealth, wiliness, and international connections were also central to the matzo libel. in these circumstances, it's not hard to see the story's appeal in some way. The details of how the Jews were receiving money from international Jewish organizations was inaccurate, but Hungarian Jews were receiving dollars and matzos, among other items, from the American Jewish organization on the basis of being Jewish, so on the basis of race, not religion. And the whole story seemed to confirm the anti-Semitic myth of an international Jewish cabal hostile to Hungary. Hungary was receiving next to no help from other international aid organizations. As a result, much of Hungary's badly needed hard currency came almost exclusively from Jewish donations. Before allowing the joint to send aid to the Hungarian Jews, the government demanded that a percentage of the money go to non-Jewish causes, disingenuously citing concerns about anti-Semitism, but they were in fact inciting anti-Semitism on other occasions. Then there was the idea that the international Jews were hostile to Hungary. And in a sense, the joint was indeed very reluctant to finance the communists. There was corruption throughout the administration of aid on the part of the Hungarian government. And so finding ways to circumvent the government by putting dollars in the matzo boxes, for example, would have been a fantasy scenario that both anti-Semites and Jews could appreciate. In 1946, if one was interpreting post-war reality through an ethnic lens, many aspects of the matzo libel rang true. So the first point I want to make is that the article accepted some of the prevailing political assumptions about black market activity, that it's dangerous, a threat to democracy, and should be condemned, but reshuffled them. First, it uncoupled Jews as an ethnic group from speculation and black market activity, and also anti-communism. Second, it argues that it was anti-Semitism, not Jewish black market activity, that was the core of the country's problems. It was the persistence of anti-Semitism that made possible that this primitive tale about dollars in the matzo created demand on the black market. So anti-Semitism was the reason that the black market was thriving. It was not the Jews. Whether or not the Jews were selling the matzo was irrelevant. And this, of course, went completely against contemporary public discourse and the government's polemics, which blurred the lines between speculators, black marketeers, and Jews. So the article is trying to use these same familiar elements to tell a very different story. The same approach can be seen in another section of the article that plays further with these terms. This is a shipment from the joint. Maybe this is I couldn't find what the Hungarian matzo boxes looked like, but this is the German matzo boxes. And this is people waiting for matzo to be distributed in Germany and in Budapest. Okay. Okay. The 5,706 Pesach Nessan's month holiday came and went. Jews, freed from the modern era slavery and saved from the hands of Arrow Cross murderers, held 2 Seder nights. Everyone had matzo on their table as long as they heeded the warnings and took care to acquire the matzo they needed. If they were satisfied with the fact that with the help of the authorized government bodies and with huge expense and extra human effort, the community's destroyed, looted, and ruined matzo bakery could be revived. If they took heed, acknowledged these results, and didn't speculate on the American gift matzo, whose arrival time was uncertain, but there were those who speculated. So here again, the author uses this highly charged and politicized term of speculator to assure the government of Jewish loyalty. And it does so partly by putting down its enemies within the Jewish community. Speculator refers not to those who sold the matzo on the black market, but rather to those who didn't want to buy their matzo from the government on time, but waited for the joint matzo. So this blurs the line between religious apostates and political enemies. The two seem almost interchangeable. Speculators, which is a term generally used for black marketeers who are understood to be Jewish, are presented here as those Jews who either didn't trust the government to rebuild the matzo factory in time or were insufficiently grateful for the government's pains and efforts in restoring it. But there are also those who didn't heed the warnings or follow the lead of the Jewish community leadership to purchase matzo to have it for Passover. Perhaps speculators are those for whom money is more important than religious observance. The point is that speculating Jews are actually a small segment of the Jewish population, according to the author. They're the bad Jews, not the majority of the religious Jewish community. The majority of the Jews, in contrast, are presented as loyal and appreciative of the government, the communists, and those who follow the lead of the religious leadership. The third point is that the article uses matzo and the question of who is entitled to receive matzo as an occasion to debate Jewishness. Who is Jewish? What's the proper way to be Jewish? And despite the fact that this newspaper, Új Élet, spoke specifically to all Jews and not just to the religious faction of the Jewish community, there's a strong argument here that Jewishness should and can only be acceptable as a religious, not as an ethnic identity. The article's author is completely dismissive of Jews who are not observant, or those who had converted, or those who are simply too assimilated, according to him. This becomes even more obvious when the author scoffs at apostates and those who don't enjoy their Easter ham without matzo ball soup. The article goes to lengths to blame the matzo affair on apostates. It talks about those who no longer Jews who felt entitled to more matzo than they were allotted, who were angry when they didn't get enough matzo, and who started stealing and looting the offices of Jewish organizations and even took the matzo set aside for rabbis and cantors. The author of the article claims that 3/4 of those asking for matzo were not really Jewish. Although that number seems high, in fact, about 30% of Jews in 1945 Hungary were converts. The religious Jewish leadership and the Jewish masses, the majority of whom the article claims were former Jews, had conflicting ideas about who belonged to the Jewish community and on what basis. The article goes on. Jews who had converted to other faiths came to ask for matzo with crosses around their necks, but their characteristic intonation belied their crucifix. They bellowed Jew-bashing slogans while waiting in line for matzo. They praised Easter ham in anticipation of their great pleasure in eating it, but also, on account of our ancestors, they got ready to eat matzo ball soup, which was likely supposed to underline their loyalty to their new faith. The hostility of the Jewish leadership to these apostates suggests a discomfort not only with Jews leaving the faith in droves, which is a quote from the article, a concern regularly voiced in the Jewish press since the turn of the century, but also with the cultural or ethnic definition of Jewishness, with Jews who felt Jewish even though they're not religious. But actually, by 1920, only a minority of Budapest Jewry was affiliated with institutional religious life. And Hungarians would have been well aware that Budapest's largely secular Jewish middle and upper middle class commonly observed Christmas and Easter at home and then went to the synagogue on high holidays. And this was understood as a normal part of being religiously Jewish and culturally Hungarian. In fact, this very newspaper, Új Élet, which was an explicitly Jewish publication, had just weeks earlier printed an advertisement on its pages urging people to buy porcelain for Easter as a gift. And that's the advertisement. So in other words, eating matzo ball soup with Easter ham was very much in line with how the Jewish middle classes in Hungary made sense of themselves in the interwar years and beyond. Their Jewish background remained of importance to them and was, if not a religious, then a cultural and social identity. Okay, so obviously my first point was that this behavior wasn't in fact strange, despite the article's insistence that it was very bad. The second point is that talking about the characteristic intonation of the Christian Jews and the Jew-bashing, hollering of the Jews in line for matzo makes clear that the author believed that there was such a thing as a certain Jewish way of acting and talking, something not quite articulated, but also not invisible. So there was this Jewish difference. And this is pretty much how non-Jews had understood Jewishness along with Jews in late 19th and early 20th century Hungary. So it was shared by society at large. The author is asking why those who are not Jewish, those who are converts, are trying to be Jewish. But at the same time, he's insisting that these people, former Jews, never succeeded in becoming non-Jewish. Everything about them was Jewish. It was obvious. So while on the surface they're arguing that Jewishness should be understood only as a religious category, and that those who are not religiously Jewish, in the way that the authors thought proper, could and shouldn't be considered Jewish. But simultaneously, it paints Jews as an ethnic category by the way they looked, the way they acted, the way they talked, and makes ample use of common cultural notions of what is Jewish and what is non-Jewish that had very little to do with religion. Okay, so in conclusion, did the immediate post-war years open up new ways of talking about Jewishness, new ways of being Jewish in Hungary? Yes and no. In the new political, economic, and cultural circumstances, Jewishness also was recast in new terms. Even if these terms are caught up in the new political controversies and terms such as speculators, black marketeers, and loud Jews returning to the faith for fun freebies such as Matzo. In many ways, however, earlier assumptions about what was Jewish and what was not Jewish continue to be very important, as this article suggested, even if some of the elements had shifted and were reinterpreted. So what I think this shows is that Jewishness was a cultural category, a category that was not primarily about what Jews or who they were, but rather something that remained a crucial way of ordering the world and of expressing and negotiating power by and for Jews and non-Jews alike. By the end of the 1940s, even such questions about Jewishness would become impossible to raise publicly. In official terms, the silence surrounding Jewishness was soon reestablished. The communists suppressed any ethnic, religious, or cultural differences in favor of an illusion of a homogeneous and unified national communist community. Although they made allowances for Jewish religious life, certain allowances, for example, there were kosher butcheries and bakeries, and Budapest had the only theological seminary in the communist bloc. And officially, anti-Semitism was banned from public speech. But the private and often unarticulated beliefs about what was Jewish and what was not Jewish in behavior, taste, culture, art, and thought continued to define everyday experience and helped people make sense of the world. Even if the word Jewish itself remained unsaid or was uttered only in shush terms, it continued to function as important cultural shorthand. Thanks very much for your attention, and I would love to answer any questions that you may have.
If anybody has any questions, please use the microphone. We'll go around.
Thank you. My name is Larry Pfeffer, originally from Budapest. Okay, small correction. I don't think that Budapest was liberated by the Soviets. Just minor remark, it was colonized by the Soviets, okay? It's a big difference. They didn't intend to liberate anything. They intended to rape and pillage and steal all the way to Berlin. Number one. Number two, I think a couple of things, you did excellent research, and it's also very entertaining about the Matzo War. But a couple of things must be said about some of the assimilated Jews. And I believe that there is such a thing, or non-Jewish Jews, which one of the leading socialist Jews in Budapest called them. You mentioned that after 1920, anti-Semitism started to raise its hand severely. Well, I think that one has to ask why. And the name of Béla Kun, or Béla Kun, pops up. Okay, his name was Béla Kun. He was born as a Kun. Okay, he probably knew how to do this with his hand. Hungary had the second Bolshevik state in the world, which fortunately was put down after 133 days. It was called the Red Terror, and what followed is the White Terror. So one must ask, the deep analysis, what was the impact of some of these assimilated Jews on anti-Semitism in Hungary in that time, during the Shoah, and what was the impact of the post-war Hungarian government, which was entirely led by, at the top level, by Jews, by Mátyás Rákosi, or Mátyás Rosenfeld, that was his name, The head of the KGB was Peter Gábor. Benjamin Eisenberg was his name. And the second in command was also Prime Minister later on, Gerő Ernő or Ernő Zinger. And we Jews don't like to talk about that very much. On the other hand, we call other people to task for the evil things that they have done. Of course, these Jews or non-Jewish Jews were not like my parents, or maybe the parents of most of you who were Jews by religion and maybe affiliated with religion. These were non-Jewish Jews, but on the other hand, they brought evil upon Hungarian people and on Jews, Hungarian Jews. And the non-Jews remember that. And we tend to deny that. The last thing that I'd like to say is something else probably ought to be mentioned. What happened in 1953 in Hungary? 1953, right before Stalin's death, there were a number of anti-Semitic plots emerging from Moscow. And in Budapest, there was a preparation for the Wallenberg trial. Many of the leading Jews were arrested, from the Neolog and the Orthodox, including the principal of my Seder, where I went to, tortured. The claim was that we Jews murdered Wallenberg in the basement of the American embassy. It's a very neat problem. It puts the blame on the imperialists and on the Jews. And again, we don't tend to talk about this, so I would encourage you not to talk about, to mention these really interesting non-Matzo stories. Thank you.
Thank you for your very interesting comment, and you're absolutely right. The Jewishness of some of the communist leaders, both in the 1919 and the case of 1945 and the communist regime, was a very, very important addition to anti-Semitism. I don't think anti-Semitism started in 1920. I mean, it was always present. This gave another element that could very easily be exploited. And yes, you're right. A lot of the Jewish communist leaders, in fact, the most visible ones, were Jewish. But this was actually only a very small percentage of the Jewish population, and communism had very low support among, well, the general population, but also among Jews. And about liberation, yes, of course. I mean, liberation is a very politically loaded term, but for a lot of Jews who survived after 1945, this in fact was experienced as a liberation. And I would say that even today, how to think about the end of the war in 1945 in Hungary is one of the major clashes in culture and society. For those on the right wing who want to say that this was from one occupation to the next occupation, and for those who want to think that yes, it was an occupation, but it was also in some sense a liberation from the fascists. So thanks very much for your comment, and I agree. There's so much more opportunity for research on the way communists and Jews appear both in politics and in the public imagination.
Thanks.
I'm Eddie Abramson. The article. I mean, from our perception, our contemporary perception, it's rabid anti-Semitism. I mean, it's so rabid, again, in contemporary terms. How was it taken? I'm not sure I understood from your presentation. How was that taken by the people who would be reading this article? Was it a shock, or was it, oh, that's just more of the same, or?
Do you mean the article itself, or the actual incident, or?
Well, the incident and the accusations and the language and.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I was trying to say. The article itself, I don't think, would have been taken as anti-Semitic, because it was presented in this Jewish newspaper, and it was using the same terms that were used by anti-Semites to make claims about Jews and their connections to black market activity and speculation. But it was trying to say something different, and it's a little bit difficult to separate those two things. But I think it was trying very hard to not say the same thing. I mean, and in terms of yes, I mean, it sounds extremely anti-Semitic when the religious Jewish leadership uses the same horrible stereotypes about Jews to talk about the non-Jewish Jews. But these were common currency in Hungary before and then after the war, and they remain so. So I don't know if they would have been necessarily seen as anti-Semitic, as just cultural ways of speaking about different types of behavior. Yeah.
more questions?
I'd ask about the newspaper. You said it continued after 1950?
Yes, it did. Yeah.
And how did it change?
Well,
how do you
I mean,
see
it
the
became
change?
really just a voice of the Communist Party, and the Jewish umbrella organization that. I mean, it's still in existence today, but it came into being in the 50s. That came to represent all Jews. It was also infiltrated by the communists. So, I mean, it was basically politically it was a party newspaper, but it also was able to publish articles on strictly religious issues.
Even though Jewishness wasn't an ethnicity you were allowed to talk about during communism? How come
Because it was a religious identity. So, Jewishness as a religion, strictly as a religion, was allowed. I mean, Catholicism was also a thing. People continue. I mean, yeah, people could. This was a very private thing. It was supposed to be in private life, but it continued, and it was allowed to some extent. I think the reason it was so difficult to talk about Jewishness in communist Hungary was that this was not the way most Hungarian Jews thought of themselves, either before or after the war.
But in the paper you showed there was an article about the Midrash.
Yeah, I mean, in the paper, especially in the first 2 years, there was a lot more openness, and there were a lot of different voices that could appear. And it's actually very interesting to read it from 1945, 1946, 1947. Even Béla Zsolt, the secular intellectual, published some articles in it. So. Yeah, it was a much more open platform at that point.
You would think that the new Communist Party should be more strict at the beginning, and it wasn't.
Yeah, it wasn't. I think they clamped down once they officially came into power. Yeah.
Was the name of the JDC mentioned in the article?
No, it
Okay.
wasn't.
Can you tell us something about the way? I don't need this. Can you tell us something about the way the board reacted, the JDC board reacted towards such an article? And can you tell us something beforehand, how the deliberation of the operation of this Matzo operation was taken? What was the decision? How did JDC make that decision, knowing the JDC operation usually did not was towards steering any balagan, let's say, in any country, up until today? This is the modus operandi of JDC.
So, if I understand correctly, there was no official reaction from the JDC to this article. I mean, it was just a small. In fact, I found only like very few mentions of anything in Hungarian newspapers related to JDC donations. I mean, it's usually involves scandals of the stuff being stolen or misappropriated or who it was distributed to. But I couldn't find anything specific to this. The only thing I found was I don't know if it's the official historian of the JDC, but there's a large history of the JDC, and the author talks about the Matzo being bought by everyone, not just Jews, in 1946. So I don't think there was that kind of echo about this. And I think, from what I've seen so far, maybe there are some secret documents that I haven't seen yet, but from what I've seen so far, I think the concern was mostly to allow the people to survive, to give them food and money, and not be concerned with the government. I mean, there was discussion about how to give the money and how to negotiate with the government, but I don't think that it was ever a question of whether they should send it or not because of this problem.
How much was the tender?
I mean, it changed every hour, I think.
We don't know
How much that actually was? Yeah, I mean, I think it was. I couldn't figure it out exactly because it was. I mean, it really changed by the hour. It was crazy.
Something very interesting in Hungary. Despite the Jewish, non-Jewish political leadership, non-Jewish Jewish leadership, Hungary was probably the only country which had a yeshiva. And I heard that from many of the communist bloc, people were sent to Paks.
Yeah.
I went to Cheder there, but I was supposed to be enrolled in the same in the Dobutsa complex. I was supposed to enroll in school and Cheder at the same time. And just when I was supposed to go to first grade, they closed down the school, but they allowed the Cheder to operate. And the synagogue was always full on holidays. And I think it was very unusual.
Yeah.
What explains that? That Hungary was exceptional in the communist bloc.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, I think part of it was the way communism operated in Hungary in general. I think it also perhaps had to do with a relatively large population, Jewish population that stayed in Hungary. It was unusual in the communist Eastern Bloc. In most communist countries, there were hardly any Jews after 1960. So I think just maybe the existence of a large population. Sorry? Even before 60, yes, but before the 60s in Poland, there were still there was a small Jewish population, but in Hungary, there was, it continued until, today. So, but yeah, I'm not really sure. I haven't really done any specific research on what explains the relative laxity of the Hungarian communists and their. I mean, of course, they shut down most. I mean, this is a very small allowance that they made. But yes, you're right that it was only in Hungary that this was even possible.
There were more Jews in the Soviet Union, and Hungary was not Rákos was not an independent operator. He took his orders from Moscow for Stalin.
Still, maybe there was different in general in the communism of in Hungary than in other places. The communist regime in Hungary, I think, was a bit different than in other places, so maybe that can explain it. Definitely.
But the same thing was in Romania.
Guys, we'll have to finish up. So thank you, Anna, very much.
Thank you.